a normal form timeline snapshot measure. Now we're going to look at um, a population measure, which is again similar to the population we saw before, essentially a count of things. But in this case, it's a count of um, these CKD patients, which are not events like um, like the surgeries that we were just looking at, but rather though these are think of them as periods of time during which a patient met some clinical criteria or inclusion criteria in general, in this case whether they had CKD, um, evaluated on each of these snapshot dates. And to the extent you find one or more patients who meet that standard as of that snapshot date, you're just going to count all of those up, and you're going to essentially have a count per patient per snapshot date. I think in this case it might be helpful to look at that result and sort of remind ourselves what that looks like before going into the measure builder. So I'm back in the report here. This is this count of CKD patients, and you can see here, well, this is a growing population of patients, but these numbers here, 136, 159, 175, these represent the patients who met the inclusion criteria of having CKD as of these snapshot dates. So it's relatively small here, but this is the January 1st, 2011 snapshot date. This is the April 1st, 2011, July 1st, 2011. So this is a quarterly report. And what this is saying is 136 patients had a timeline record whose period start and end dates, 136 patients had records in one of these timeline objects that both met the inclusion criteria, in this case having CKD, and had period start and end dates that contained this snapshot date, meaning that as of that snapshot date, the patient had that qualifying pattern of characteristics. In this case, they had CKD, and therefore they're going to be included. If we go into case review, you can see that each row here is a different patient. Each of these patients have a period start and end date, although it's actually not published in this measure, so you don't see it. But potentially they have their own period start and end dates, but they're all being evaluated as of a single date. So you can see automatically IRSA applies a single snapshot date to case review here. And often what you're looking at is maybe the most recent available snapshot date. You can change this to look at other snapshot dates worth of patients. And so all of these patients here, as of October 1st, 2014, met the inclusion criteria of having CKD. Okay, so now into the actual measure itself. This is CKD P01. Okay, so again, we see the use of this count measure checkbox. Now our temporal structure is timeline snapshot, and we've got this helpful reminder here that if what you want to do is count entities, like a patient, the structure you want is a timeline snapshot. Again, behind the scenes here, this is essentially saying there's a denominator of a single case, which is the entire universe of data. And what we're doing is counting for every one of those how many patients there are who meet this inclusion criteria as of each snapshot date. But by clicking this, I remove a bunch of sort of unnecessary parameters. Unnecessary because for count measures they all take a particular value, and we're automatically selecting those on the user's behalf. Okay, so something that's not being shown, just like it wasn't shown in the event population, is the component class. That's because it's always going to be long form here. If you think about it, again, what's going on is there's a single denominator observation for every snapshot date, and then between 0 and infinity patients who are going to meet the numerator, who are going to meet the clinical criteria and therefore be included as numerators in this this count measure. Another useful heuristic, or I don't know, mnemonic, or way to think about what a count measure is it's just like a standard measure, which is typically a rate measure where you can have multiple things in the denominator. It's like a rate measure where it's instead of a rate per patient or a rate per something of which there can be many, it's a rate per universe. It's a rate per just one thing. It's a rate per the world. If I'm counting patients, what I'm saying is, well, how many patients are there? Well, there's 100 CKD patients. Well, there's 100 CKD patients per universe of patients that I'm interested in capturing. A rate variant of that would be, well, there's a count of patients, but I'm interested in the count per nephrology physician group, of which there might be 10 in my data. Okay, so that would no longer really be a count measure. That would be a rate measure. It's a rate per. It's not a rate per patient, but it still is a rate per something. But if my denominator here is truly just 1, I'm not trying to divide a count or a tally of something by something of which there might be many instances. I'm really just counting up those events or those entities per world or per universe. That's what a count measure is. It's a rate per 1, essentially, and that's how we're representing it behind the scenes. Again, a lot of that is obscured by clicking the count measure checkbox, but fundamentally behind the scenes, that's how we structure those. And so it's really the same set of rules behind the scenes, with just some tweaks in how it's parameterized to go from a rate measure to a count measure. They're really the same same underlying structure. Okay, that was a bit of a digression, but I think getting a handle on the distinction between count and rate measures, or count and sort of regular measures, because most measures are rate measures, is an important part of understanding how to use the IRSA measure authoring tool here. Okay, so we've seen these. The numerator and denominator contributions is maybe the last stop on this measure. The denominator is 1, which is to say 1 per universe, or really 1 per universe snapshot date, because we're going to be crossing that the existence of the universe with this schedule of check-in dates, each becoming a denominator observation, and each of those denominator observations is going to contribute just 1. Whereas the numerator is where the sort of interesting stuff is happening. I guess that whole bit about the denominator is also interesting, but the numerator is where we're counting up the patients that meet that inclusion criteria as of the snapshot date, and we see our friend case is null here, which is the easiest way to capture this rule, where if you don't find any patients that meet the standard, well, you've got a null patient ID, and therefore you're contributing 0. But if you do find a non-null patient ID, that means you found a patient that meets the criteria as of that snapshot date. That generates a 1. Again, we're not seeing the aggregation function because that's being hidden when you select a count measure, but it's going to be a sum. You're summing up all the patients as of that snapshot date that meet the inclusion criteria. Okay, maybe I'll say these entity effective dates are also necessary to add in, but it's working exactly the same way it did when we were looking at a rate measure or a regular measure, and we had a timeline in the denominator, whether it was a timeline period or a timeline snapshot. The same idea. You just need to tell URSA which fields are capturing the beginning and the end of each record's covered period. And okay, I think that's it. All right, so that's 6 examples of measures. 2 event measures, 2 timeline period measures, 2 timeline snapshot measures, with a mix of populations and which is to say count measures and sort of standard measures or normal measures or rate measures, non-count measures, and a little bit more color on which of those structures go with different component classes and how you can use those different component classes to create a different experience for the end user in case review when reviewing results. Okay, that's it.